Since 1945, the United States has deployed millions of troops across the globe, built the most powerful alliance in history, and won nearly every major battle it fought. Yet from Korea to Afghanistan, not one of those conflicts ever fully ended. Those unresolved wars still drive the alliances, crises, and rivalries shaping your world right now. The question was never whether America can win a war. It is why winning was never enough. A war can end on paper long before the conflict itself disappears. Military victory delivers control of territory, but it does not resolve who holds legitimate power or how rival claims are settled. In many of America's most consequential interventions, the fighting stopped while deep political divisions remained. This is the difference between an armistice and a true peace. An armistice can suspend violence, but it does not erase the causes of conflict. Borders may be drawn, governments installed, but questions of legitimacy, identity, and ideology can persist for generations. Territorial disputes, rival authorities, and competing worldviews often survive long after the last shots are fired. The real test is not just how a war ends on the battlefield, but what kind of order follows. Again and again, the gap between military success and lasting political settlement has shaped the world we live in. World War II left the United States with unmatched industrial capacity and a military presence that spanned the globe. President Harry Truman, facing a world in ruins, became the architect of a new international system. The United Nations was established in 1945, offering a forum for diplomacy and collective security. At Bretton Woods in 1944, the United States helped create the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, anchoring the global economy to the dollar and setting rules for trade and finance. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization bound the United States to the defense of Western Europe, making collective security a permanent feature of the post-war order. Truman's address to Congress in March 1947, known as the Truman Doctrine, committed American resources to countering Soviet influence in Greece and Turkey, turning containment into a guiding principle for decades. Under the National Security Act of 1947, the United States built a national security apparatus capable of projecting power worldwide. Intervention became routine, backed by alliances, economic leverage, and a growing defense industry. By the early 1950s, America had assembled the tools to intervene almost anywhere, shaping events far beyond its own borders and making global involvement the new normal. The Korean War came to a halt on July 27, 1953, not with a peace treaty, but with an armistice that left the core conflict unresolved. The fighting stopped, yet the peninsula remained split at the 38th parallel. A 4-kilometer-wide demilitarized zone, or DMZ, was drawn across the waste of Korea. Its barbed wire and guard towers still divide families, economies, and political systems. On one side, the United States committed to a permanent military presence in South Korea, anchored by the 1954 Mutual Defense Treaty and a forward deployment of tens of thousands of troops. On the other side, a communist regime survived in the north, backed by China and the Soviet Union. The armistice created a tense equilibrium, but not a settlement. No comprehensive peace agreement ever followed. Instead, two rival orders endured, each claiming legitimacy, each preparing for renewed conflict. The DMZ stands as a physical reminder of a war frozen in place, where deterrence became the substitute for true resolution. Korea remains the first and clearest example of how military power can stop a war, but not settle the questions that made it start. Vietnam became the proving ground for America's strategy of containment in the Cold War. Determined to stop the spread of communism, the United States committed over 500,000 troops at the war's peak, pouring in vast resources and firepower. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara embodied the logic of escalation, believing that more troops, more bombing, and more data could tip the balance. United States forces measured progress through body counts and territory cleared. But the political foundation in South Vietnam remained fragile. Corruption, weak institutions, and limited popular support plagued the Saigon government. Despite tactical victories and overwhelming force, the core problem, building a legitimate, stable state, remained unsolved. When Congress approved the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, American troops began to withdraw. 2 years later, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. The collapse of South Vietnam in April 1975 revealed that the war had been lost politically before it was lost militarily. The shock of defeat left deep scars on American strategy, forcing a reckoning with the limits of military power in shaping political order. The Middle East stands at the crossroads of global energy, strategic alliances, and regional rivalries. For decades, American interests have centered on securing oil flows, supporting partners like Israel and Saudi Arabia, and countering threats ranging from state adversaries to terror groups. Each of these priorities pulls policy in a different direction. Energy security means close ties with Gulf monarchies, even as alliance management requires balancing relationships with Israel and Arab states. Regional rivalries, Saudi Arabia and Iran, Turkey and Egypt, layer new complications on every decision. The Arab-Israeli conflict, unresolved since 1948, keeps the region on edge, shaping perceptions and fueling mistrust. When the United States intervenes to contain one crisis or support one ally, new dilemmas often arise elsewhere. Efforts to stabilize one part of the region can unsettle another, turning every solution into a new set of trade-offs. In the Middle East, the quest for stability rarely leads to a clean or lasting outcome. In the spring of 2003, American forces swept into Baghdad in just 3 weeks, toppling Saddam Hussein's regime with a display of overwhelming speed and firepower. Yet as the statue fell in Firdos Square, the foundations of Iraq's political order crumbled just as quickly. The Coalition Provisional Authority, led by civilian administrators, dissolved the Iraqi army and launched a sweeping de-Baathification campaign, removing hundreds of thousands of officials and security personnel from public life. With established institutions dismantled overnight, no credible replacement stood ready to take their place. Ministries sat empty, police forces evaporated, and the basic functions of government stalled. Into this vacuum, old rivalries and new grievances surged. Sectarian tensions between Sunni and Shia deepened as power shifted, and extremist groups found fertile ground among the disenfranchised and the fearful. The rapid military victory exposed the challenge at the heart of intervention. Removing a dictator is far easier than building a legitimate, stable order in the ruins that follow. The campaign in Afghanistan began as a swift response to the September 11th attacks, with the goal of dismantling al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban from power. Within months, the Taliban regime collapsed, and a new interim government took shape under the Bonn Agreement, promising elections and a constitution. What followed was not a quick exit, but a nearly 20-year effort to build a functioning state. Billions of dollars flowed into reconstruction, training security forces, and establishing new courts and ministries. At its height, the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces counted nearly 300,000 personnel, and international troops reached over 140,000. Yet the political order remained fragile. Corruption, patronage, and a lack of local legitimacy limited the government's reach, even as new schools and clinics opened. SIGAR reports across 2 decades documented repeated warnings from Afghan officials about the shallow roots of these institutions. When the United States and its allies withdrew in August 2021, the Afghan state unraveled in a matter of weeks. The Taliban swept back into Kabul almost 20 years to the day after their initial defeat. Afghanistan stands as the longest-running example of how outside intervention can build structures, but not always the deep legitimacy needed for them to endure. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought an end to one of history's most intense rivalries, but it did not deliver a settled order in Europe. As the Russian flag replaced the Soviet banner over the Kremlin, the boundaries of influence across the continent were redrawn. NATO expanded eastward, welcoming former Warsaw Pact states and shifting the alliance's front line closer to Russia's borders. In Moscow, this new security map was seen not as a guarantee of peace, but as a threat to Russia's strategic depth and its role in European affairs. The sense of lost influence and encirclement grew as NATO admitted Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in 1999. Then 7 more countries in 2004. The old ideological battle between communism and capitalism faded, replaced by a contest over spheres of influence and competing visions for Europe's future. The unresolved questions of order and legitimacy resurfaced in the conflict over Ukraine, where Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the invasion in 2022 reignited disputes that were never fully settled when the Cold War ended. China's rise as a global power has unfolded along a different path from earlier rivals. For decades, American policymakers believed that economic integration would draw China toward political liberalization and shared rules. Instead, economic ties deepened while political systems remained distinct. By 2025, the U.S.-China trade relationship had fractured, with American farm exports to China slashed by more than 60%, and new supply chain rules forcing companies to rethink their global strategies. Technology became a central battleground. U.S. export controls on advanced semiconductors and AI chips aimed to slow China's progress, while China invested heavily in developing its own chip industry and tightened controls on outbound technology and critical minerals. The contest now extends to the world's oceans as the Chinese Navy expands its fleet to rival the U.S. in total ship numbers, and both sides maneuver for influence across the Indo-Pacific. Alliances, regional security, and trade networks are caught in the crossfire. The pattern is clear. Competition persists, shifting from battlefields to boardrooms, supply chains, and digital infrastructure. American power can shape the environment, but the outcomes remain unpredictable. In this unresolved rivalry, the stakes are written into the alliances, technology standards, and economic ties that will define the next era of world politics. Global power still hinges on more than victory. It depends on building legitimacy that lasts. As new crises test old alliances, the challenge remains unsolved. Military strength alone cannot resolve the world's deepest divisions. The hardest conflict to win is the one that never truly ends. Share your thoughts below.